The moment is here, you can stop your search. It's Comics by Perch.
Hey everybody, this is Perch. Is it okay for your comic not to matter? I've been doing videos on this topic, kind of around it, but it's something that's becoming more and more of a kind of firm idea in my mind. And this listener wrote in and it sounds like the same opinion. But I think this is a really important point, and it's one of those self-sabotage things that I think is going on in comics right now. So Neil goes, "Hey Perch, hope you're doing good. If there's an easy $10 in it for you to keep the channel going, there's easy $10 for you. Okay, $10. All right, that's all it took. Keep it going. Don't spend it all at once." I mean, so in other words, I couldn't afford God's number one. Anyway, so the mail goes on. So I've been on an 80s kick recently, and it's occurred to me how many of the best comics from this era were just never explored again. You wouldn't say any of these books mattered. Despite this, or maybe because of it, they are considered some of the best comics even today. One of my favorites is Brave and the Bold, a monthly Batman team-up comic that had zero consequences for anything in DC. These writers didn't care if their story was groundbreaking or a landmark comic. They just told some damn fine stories with some incredible art. Do you think a lot of modern comic writers are driven by a warped idea of what it means for their comic to matter? When I think of a comic mattering, I think of a comic that people read it and then they say, fuck, I got to tell somebody about this comic and hope there's more. What I don't think about is, man, this comic really sticks it to Trump and exposes capitalism in the most subversive way possible. I wish people would be comfortable with the idea that a series that isn't profound, it's just awesome. Sometimes it's okay to be a Nicolas Cage action movie and not a deep Stanley Kubrick character study. Maybe I sound like a Neanderthal, but I'm not picking up comics to have my worldview shaken or to think about deep topics. I'm there to see some action, preferably with an interesting story to go along with it. So that's me. I think it does a really good job of explaining kind of a frustration that's going on. And I agree. I think that's a major issue we have with comics today. And I use this analogy. You don't all have to be Alan Moore. Now, that doesn't mean Alan Moore's stuff is bad. It just doesn't mean that everything has to be Alan Moore. It's an and, not an or. So I think that there's a lot of writers. We can look at it a number of different ways. First of all, there's a lot of writers that are just flat out, and may hurt to hear it, not as talented as Alan Moore. You do not have the skills to write and basically juggle all of those different elements. It's hard to do. And by the way, you may or may not like Alan Moore, but whether you like the writing or dislike the writing, you can probably accept or at least look at that and go, hey, there's a deeper level of storytelling going on here. He's trying to do something. I'll use one that probably more of you will object to, and that's Tom King. Tom King did that Vision series for Marvel as a more in-depth, kind of creepy, different look at, deconstructed version of a hero. And, by and large, and I mean, it seems hard to a lot of people to admit it today, that story was popular. People really liked it. They liked what Tom King did. They liked that it was a kind of a deeper type of story. Now, I think where things have fallen apart a little bit is he's gone on to tell that same story like 12 different times. And you're starting to notice, hey, wait a minute, maybe this guy isn't an amazing writer. Maybe he just knows how to do this one thing. And the one thing could be fun, but over and over and over and over again, it's, the groundbreaking aspect of it, which was the poll, can you believe I'm reading this, starts to wear off. But regardless of Tom King, I mean, not every comic, whether it's done well or done poorly, needs to be that. Comics can just be entertaining. One of the comics that is well-beloved and sold, well over 100,000 copies, granted it was a newsstand, was G.I. Joe back in the 80s. Now, no shade against Larry Hama, but those stories were not Watchmen. They were entertaining, though. They were good. They had, subplots, and they had continuity, and, good things happened in those comics. But the comics were not trying to deconstruct what it means to, the superhero identity and, layer it against the macroeconomics of capitalism. It wasn't trying to do any of that. It was trying to be entertaining. And I do think there was, there's definitely more. I mean, a different video that I recorded around, is part of the problem that comics just, got a little bit too full of themselves, that they have to be an elevated form of storytelling. And so is that part of the problem? I mean, I think these things all play together, but that is the big trap, I think, in a lot of comics, is that they're trying to be more than they need to be. And it doesn't, there should be deep stories. I don't want a world of nothing but fluff. I want a variety. I do want stories that are, exploring kind of deeper deconstructed topics. I do. I just don't want them all the time. And ideally, I think the model in the 80s that worked quite well is those stories were done in isolation. They were Elseworld stories, or they were something like The Watchmen, where it stood on its own. And you didn't have to worry about the inherent problem in deconstructing the hell out of a superhero and then, having to continue to sell monthly issues. I've heard this described before from people like, well, one of the problems with comics is the fact they keep going. It's like, no, that's the business model. That's the bank in comics. You want it to keep going, so you continue to draw equity from it. And the argument becomes, well, yeah, but then, if you deconstruct, say, Spider-Man, and you really warp him, it's impossible to continue telling stories. And the answer is, then don't do that to Spider-Man, a comic book where you want to tell lots of other stories, or do your, graphic novel, do your different thing. I mean, look, Carrie Andrews and Rain did not need to live with continuity. It did not need to live with everything else. It stood on its own, and it did just fine. Watchmen stood on its own and did just fine until DC started to draw it into its continuity. But you can have these stories just stand alone. You could do your Batman story, and you could have it be, like Dark Knight Returns. Dark Knight Returns was never meant to, influence and warp the main Batman title. Never. That was never the goal of that comic. And it stood alone, and it's still Batman, and it did just fine. That's the dynamic that we're trying to get to. That's where comics need to go. And so, doing stories where you break the character because you've deconstructed and done that more serious take, and then you come back later and be like, well, now it's impossible to tell an entertaining story. Well, dumbass, you did that to yourself. You didn't need to do that. That was not necessary. And I think that's the solution to this problem, again, super easy, barely an inconvenience. You just tell the story as a separate thing. It lives on its own, and it works just fine when you do that. I mean, really, not a problem at all. It only gets screwed up when you try and, say, well, I need to be a serious storyteller, so I need to tell a serious story. And then you proceed to screw up, the main comic to tell your serious story. That completely unnecessary for you to do. So that's kind of that's the world and the dynamic that we're living in. Again, not that hard to avoid. Just takes proper thought, proper planning, being a little bit careful about it. It's really very simple if you respect the universe and you respect the things that happen. But comics just being entertaining is okay. And the stigma about comics need to be more, first off, get over yourself a little bit. The story you're telling is not more. In many cases, it's incredibly derivative. And then just beyond that, like, look, you forgot the entertain part. Anyway, I want to thank the letter writer. I think did a really good job of summing up the topic. And that said perfectly. What do the rest of you think? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course. And thanks for listening.